Good morning. Welcome to the estuarium at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab's Boardwalk Dog Program. My name is Mendel Graber. I'm one of the educators at the lab, and we are at the Grand Bay Oyster Park with Dr. Adriane Michaelis, who is going to show us some of the operations out here and tell us a little bit about oysters and some of the benefits that this farming operation provides and some of the ecosystem services that oysters themselves provide. So with that, I will let Dr. Michaelis get started.
Thank you, Mendel, and hi to everyone out there watching. So first, just to give a little bit of overview of where we are. So this is, as she said, the Grand Bay Oyster Park. We're near Bayou La Batterie, Alabama, and this park is one that has sort of all things oyster aquaculture happening. And so if you look out across right now, we can see with Auburn University Shellfish Lab, which is who I work for, we have research going on, and this research is applied and aims to answer all sorts of questions that can help support shell fisheries. And the boat that you can see out in the distance is actually part of a partnership between the Auburn Shellfish Lab and a nonprofit called the Alabama Oyster Social that does vocational training for high schoolers and also operates an oyster farm. And so this is the Bonus Point Oyster Farm that's out working. And then we also have a number of commercial farms that are working out here. And so there's, looks like just one or two that are out here today, but you can see sort of behind me, there are commercial oyster farms. And some of you may be asking, what does it actually mean to farm oysters? And so when we talk about farming oysters, oyster aquaculture, or you might hear it called oyster mariculture, it's essentially talking about the cultivation of oysters. So caring like a farmer would tend to any crop. And typically that involves oysters that are spawned in a hatchery. So we have mom adult oysters and dad adult oysters in a hatchery that produce babies, and this seed then comes out to a farm like this. And here in Grand Bay, all of these oysters are being grown off bottom, and so they're in containers. And so here's an example. We have baskets like these hanging off of long lines that are filled with oysters, and so we just pulled this one out of the water. And so you can see it's got some algae growing on it, and we'll dump one in a little bit and look at the oysters and some of the other critters that hang out inside. Yeah, we got barnacles set. And so part of what an oyster farmer has to do is tend this gear. So they bring it out to dry it, to clean it, to make sure the oysters can get all the food and water that they need. And so oysters getting some of that food and water is one example of what I want to talk about today. So my research up until this point with my PhD focused on ecosystem services. And so this is kind of a big word, but it describes the benefits that we get from an ecosystem, or in this case from oysters. And oysters do two really important things. One of them, filter water. So as they're feeding, they're helping to clean the water and to clarify the water. So they're eating algae, helping to make the water clearer so you might be able to see through it a little bit more, which is good for the plants at the bottom and other animals living there. And they also can help capture nitrogen and other nutrients. So if there's excess nitrogen, oysters are one way to help reduce that number. And gear, or habitat that oysters form, so normally in the wild they're forming reefs, but aquaculture gear like we see here can do the same sort of thing. It helps protect shorelines, so by buffering wave actions when storm comes through. And it also provides safe hiding places for animals. And so we can look in this basket here, which this is one from one of our longline systems. And you can already see a crab scurrying out. And so these are farmed oysters. We even have, it looks like a male blue crab that has made its way in. And so if you remember looking, the mesh, the holes to get in this aren't very big. But so this crab came in when he was much smaller and has been living happily inside this container growing out. And so we see oysters, whether they're farmed or in a wild reef, can provide habitat, they provide hiding places, they also provide a source of food for lots of animals. And typically around oyster farms like this, you'd also see lots of bigger predators, so bigger fish that swim around and hunt some of these critters that are hanging out inside the bags. And then in here, you can see lots of grass shrimp that came in off of one of the baskets. And Mendel's going to pull some out.
Maybe. This one is gravid. She has eggs. So this is a full-grown grass shrimp. Well, and I let her jump away. They jump.
Let's see.
So you can
Here's
see the
another
little
one.
brown mass on the underside. This one actually got squished, so she's not going to jump away. So that one, by contrast, does not have an egg mass. You can see the brown egg mass on that one.
Right, and so another thing I'll point out, so with these oysters, you can see there is some variation in size, but overall we have a lot of similarly sized and shaped oysters, and I'll talk about that a little bit when I get into some of these benefits that people get from working with oysters. And so habitat formation, filtering water, in addition to contributing to natural populations through spawning, are a number of the ecosystem services that we typically hear about. But there's another type of ecosystem service, which just makes the term even longer, but cultural ecosystem services, and that's been the focus of my work. And so you can see the commercial farms behind us, and that has been sort of the feature of my research, is working with commercial farmers, working with wild shell fishermen, and working with other people that do industry support roles. And when I talk about industry support, I'm talking about research scientists, regulators, gear manufacturers, so the people that are making baskets like these for the oyster industry, and focusing on the social and cultural benefits that they get from their work. And so I know that this is sort of a vague term when we're talking about it, but just to give a couple examples. So in wild shell fisheries and wild fisheries overall, we know that they have high levels of job satisfaction. And so compared to especially land-based occupations, people working in wild fisheries have a higher job satisfaction and higher sense of well-being, and may even stay in a fishery when it doesn't make good financial sense, because there are so many other things about the job that make it worth it. And so that's one way you can think of a cultural benefit by working with oysters that people get at an individual level. Another way you can think of it bigger at a community level. So over in Bayou La Battery is known for its seafood industry, especially its shrimp and oysters. And this contribution creates a community identity, it contributes to local heritage, and it provides sense of place. So it's another way that we're getting these sort of social and cultural benefits from something sort of as humble and simple looking as the oyster. So these guys are doing a lot more than what you might think from just the little shell. And so my work, if I untangle myself here, my research has focused on these social and cultural benefits to answer the question of, can farming oysters, like we see right here, provide these same sorts of benefits as a wild fishery? And this is especially important in areas where wild fisheries might be in decline, but it's also just good information for those that might be considering entering the industry or doing it as a supplement to work in a wild fishery. And so to answer that question, I worked in 7 states. So I was down here, right here in Alabama last winter, but also went to Mississippi, Florida, Maryland, Virginia, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, and was essentially traveling, spending a couple months in each state, working with folks and interviewing them. And again, to get at this question, what are the benefits? What's good about working with oysters? And what I found out was that there's a ton of good things about working with oysters. And so I have a very long list of these sorts of cultural benefits, which I frame using identities, experiences, and capabilities. And so to give some examples, and I won't go through all of the benefits, there are many, but with identities, so I did hear from people that it is providing community identities and individual identities. So an occupation as a shellfish farmer, or oyster farmer, is something people are proud of. We see in places where aquaculture has been a means to help supplement wild fisheries and contribute to a community identity of working the water and contribute to extending the seafood industry in local places. And some places it's taken on the identity. So for example, Cedar Key and their clam aquaculture. Cedar Key is known for its clams in Cedar Key, Florida. And so that's one way that aquaculture is helping to create these identities and contribute to heritage. People have also talked about experiences, and a number of experiences. So you can see as we're standing out here, we have a pelican that just dove right next to us, and pelicans sort of all along the piling. And so people talk about the relationships with nature that they have through their work and see this as a great benefit. And some of it is just being able to be out here and observing this all on a day-to-day. Others are learning about it and learning how seasonal changes and different water quality changes are affecting the animals and the plants.
Stimulating.
Yeah, you know, it's even today it's kind of cloudy, maybe not the most beautiful day, but still sort of a great view and a great place to be.
Yeah, it's nice and cool and breezy.
And yeah, the sun's not melting us right now. And other experiences, people talk about their relationships with people. So even like today, as an example, I'm here talking with these wonderful folks, talking with you who are watching through Facebook. And working with Oysters affords people opportunities to make connections that they otherwise might not have. And this includes when they're shucking their oysters and serving customers and having these sorts of social relationships. And then the last thing, people talked about capabilities. And so this is knowledge and skills that they're gaining through their work. Also talking about income, which it's a job, so they do want to make an income off of it. But it's an income that they can earn while staying on the water. It's an income that they can earn while working with their family, maybe starting a family business. And for some that have worked in wild fisheries, it's an income that is slightly more stable. And so people talked about that, the stability of knowing that you can bring these oysters to market in a certain amount of time. And it's not foolproof, it's not perfect. Heavy storm events, extended periods of low salinity can impact farmed oysters just like it can the wild, but it is slightly more reliable and predictable for most of the folks that I've talked to. And this connects to a different experience of independence. And so that's one of the things that's typically associated with wild fisheries. Folks that do wild harvest like the fact that they're their own boss. They can choose when they go out, they can choose when they don't. The work that they put in, that's what generates the results they get back. And with oyster farming, it's the same thing. And so people talked about that a lot. They may have left other fields, but now they're happy that they're their own boss and they're sort of out here generating a food product to give to people. And so this is kind of the short. And Mendel, do you have a question coming through now?
I have a question myself.
Okay.
I'm checking for questions, but I think a lot of people are familiar with the extension service, the land-based extension service that is like the land-grant colleges like Auburn and Mississippi State, and you know, they sort of understand a little bit more about the services that those extension offices provide, like soil testing, or like maybe some sort of agricultural classes, like beekeeping classes, or but I don't think people are as familiar with the extension services that are coastal. Could you talk about that program just a little bit?
Yeah, sure. With Alabama Cooperative Extension Service and Auburn Shellfish Lab. So we have a team, including Becky, who's out over on the water over there, that they'll help with. If people have questions about oyster farming, they'll certainly answer questions. If someone's considering getting into aquaculture, there are training programs, and this year's a little bit different because of COVID, but normally there's a hands-on course in Alabama. There's one going on in Mississippi where people can learn about oyster farming and sort of get a feel for what this actually means. So it's one thing to talk about it and see pictures of it, but to be in the water, to be working the gear, sort of gives a much better perspective on it. We have a business specialist, Rusty Grice, who can give advice on business plans. He's not going to write a business plan for you, but he can help folks get started if they have questions as they're developing the plan for their new oyster farm.
For example, getting the gear and getting loans, because this is a relatively new industry in Alabama. It's been here for about 10 or 11 years. But if you've got banks, you know, that you're applying for a loan and it's sort of an unfamiliar risk to them, you know, so the extension service will help navigate those kinds of challenges. And also, as I understand it, you know, insuring the gear and...
Yeah, and because it's a new industry, or newer in parts, especially down here in the Gulf, there are some challenges, like you mentioned, with getting a loan and, you know, convincing someone that maybe has never heard of farmed oysters that this is a viable investment. And the same thing with gear too. And there's still work to be done to do sort of crop insurance that's appropriate for farmed oysters. And there's a lot of people that are constantly working to make that better. As one example of you know, the potential, so in Maryland, where I came from most recently, there's a state funding program, a state low-interest loan opportunity that is available for people considering aquaculture, and so it can help to do some of that initial capital.
We had a comment from Bill that you may need to repeat the question, because I'm not mic'd.
Oh,
so
thank you, Bill.
Repeat the question when you're answering. We have another question. What is the time to harvest?
So what is the time to harvest? So that depends on the location. Down here in these warmer, saltier waters in the Gulf are typically warmer, saltier waters. It's a little bit faster than it might be up north in colder climates. And so here in a typical year that hasn't experienced a big sort of freshet of water and tons of storms, they can grow a market oyster in about a year. If we have a lot of fresh water, a lot of rain, that can slow that down. And as a comparative point, up in Maryland, it's more likely to take 2 to 3 years to get an oyster to market.
So I would just like to clarify for some folks who this may not be clear to everyone. And you were talking about the process of putting the male and the female oysters. So just to clarify, oysters are animals.
Right.
And Auburn is still, as I understand it, running a nursery program, right?
Yeah, so Auburn does have, so the question is about Auburn's nursery program. We do have a hatchery and nursery at Auburn that is producing seed for research, not for commercial sale right now.
So you say seed, but that is the word for...
So that is the baby oysters that come out to farm. So when we're talking about, there's a lot of different words describing baby oysters. And so we have larvae. So that is the males and females, mom and dad, have sent out their sperm and eggs, which have found each other in the magic of reproduction and create larvae. They become spat once they settle on a surface. And so with these oysters, it's through a culchless operation, which means that they're designed to be single oysters instead of a clump. So in a wild setting, you might see clumps where there's multiple oysters attached to a single shell. There's also hatchery reproduction like that we call spat-on-shell production. So
as I understand it, the long-term goal would be to get some of the folks who are interested in the industry end of this, rather than the research and the extension element of it, to start a nursery in this area.
Right. So I'll repeat the question again. Is the idea that we would like folks in the area to start a nursery? And of course, like, Auburn's trying to help facilitate to get people to get started, whether it's having their own hatchery. We do have a hatchery just within our line of sight right now, but to have hatcheries, to have nurseries, to help have a sort of self-sustaining industry. And of course, the Auburn lab is here to help facilitate that and answer the questions that people might have and help train people to do that sort of thing.
You have a shout out from Provincetown, Massachusetts, and then we also had a question from somebody, who may have missed it at the beginning. Where are we right now? How deep is the water? And can fishermen walk out to the oysters?
Okay, so questions about where we are, how deep is the water, can we walk out? Or can fishermen walk out? So here, we're in Grand Bay, the Grand Bay Oyster Park. So the closest town is Bayou La Battery, and we're near Point of Pines. And so this oyster park, depending on where you are in the site, can range from maybe about 4 feet deep to over your head. And if somebody wanted to walk out here, they probably could. They'd have to swim at points. But it is tough to access. So if you want to sort of spin around behind us, it's not a developed area. And if the question about can fishermen walk out to it is about those that are working. So no, typically they take a boat out to their site. And so we took a boat out here today.
To the shore, Angela? That way? Come back around. Show the proximity to Point of Pines.
And so there is some development on the shoreline here. But for the most part, if anyone's coming out to work oysters at this site, they're doing it on a boat. And a lot of the gear is designed for that. So it's designed to work off a boat or jump in the water and work it. And so I don't know if you'll be able to see, but where Becky is working over in the distance, you can see she's on deck, but there are 2 people working in the water with her.
Can you come back over to the gear and show this gear? And I've got a couple of questions about your early comments. So you were talking about pulling this out of the water and drying it, and you made reference to this helping the oysters get food. So you can see that this is covered in algae, okay? And there are also some barnacles on it. So we got some worms and some shrimp and things over here. So when you pull this out of the water and dry it, a lot of these organisms, we might refer to them as biofouling organisms, the ones that are undesirable in this particular operation. There are a lot of barnacles on this side. So if you didn't do that, they might, encrust and sort of cover up the mesh, the holes in this mesh, preventing the water flow that feeds the oysters. So can you talk about how the oysters get their nutrients? The farmers are not feeding them per se.
Right.
And also like the process of pulling them out and how long they stay out, and the oyster's resilience to them being out of the water, while these other organisms, not just animals, but the barnacles are animals, but also the algae, how they respond to that drying, and then the little animals that sort of came out when we opened the cage.
Sure. And so to repeat the question is just to
I think I might have been closer to the mic. You might not.
Okay. Well, so to describe sort of the process to dry these cages and make them suitable for oysters, you can imagine how, looking at this, if we were to let this get out of hand, that this could grow and cover all these holes. So right now the holes are critical to allow water through and the oysters to filter. So when an oyster, and I'm going to use this one is dead, this is a dead oyster, but to use as an example, so an oyster will be closed but can filter water, and it may open and test the water. If that water doesn't have oxygen in it, then the oyster is going to want to stay closed. If that water doesn't have food in it, then it's not going to be able to get nutrients. So if you aren't tending to gear like this and it gets covered, then that oyster has no food, it has no oxygen, and it won't be able to survive. But it's important to remember these animals, so especially in different parts of the coast, are designed or adapted to intertidal life, even though in a lot of places they exist underwater the whole time. In some places these reefs are exposed at low tide, so they're used to variability in salinity, oxygen, and even being in the water, but they can only tolerate it for so long. And so to make sure that these oysters stay happy, farmers will use, so this gear for example, and you can kind of see if we look out on this closest line here, you can see how some of them are just starting to be exposed. But so this system is designed so that a farmer can move the lines, and the entire line of baskets could be out of the water, and then they have control over how much time those oysters are out of the water. And so it becomes a balance, and Auburn's been doing some research to investigate this and see what is an appropriate drying time and in terms of oyster survival. And so farmers can decide if they want to dry like that for 6 hours, if they want to dry like that for 24 hours, and evaluate sort of if it cleans the gear in the way that they want and how their oysters handle it. And this is all sort of within regulation to make sure that those oysters are still safe and healthy. So nobody's going to be drying oysters for days before they go to harvest or anything. But so that would be some of the considerations to think about. But the gear is designed to do that. Some people, if they have the luxury of space to store gear and the luxury of finances to pay for it, may just have replacement gear. And so instead of power washing or cleaning the gear, they may bring it back, let it dry for a little bit, and then you can easily scrape some of this off. In terms of what happens with the animals, so our blue crab is hiding now, unless you put it back in. So the animals that are in here get put back in the water. If they're like this blue crab, obviously couldn't get through those holes at this point.
They just drop down into the water, right?
Yep. And so the animals will get back in the water. Some of them may end up, after these oysters are sorted and put back into a basket, the animals may still be with them. The idea, unfortunately, for the barnacles that are on these cages and even on these oysters, so you'll see we have some set on the oysters themselves, is those barnacles will die when they're exposed to the air and dried out for a period of time.
So you see a few also little tracks in that oyster there. So you have some organisms like worms that will burrow into the oyster shell, and so that drying will encourage the worms to drop out of them too.
Yeah. So essentially when they're drying, anything that can will try to leave and get back into the water.
So we have a question of how many oyster farms are in this area?
So in this park, I believe there are, I'm looking to see if Glenn is listening, but there's 5 or more farms that are working here.
5 farms in this park?
Yeah, so there's 5. There are some that are near, but this isn't the only site for oyster farming in Alabama. So there are other sites closer to the bay, behind Dauphin Island. Over on the other side of Mobile Bay, there are also oyster farms. And so this is just one park that we're at today.
So the farmers lease these sort of plots of land, except it's not land, it's water, from the state of Alabama.
Yep, and so the farmers will lease it from the state, and so they're essentially renting this spot, and it varies from state to state on how long that lease period is. And some states have different what are called riparian rights, so somebody may be able to farm oysters off of their own land because of these rights. But here, people are leasing it. They do have to do sort of a contract to be able to do that and follow all the rules and regulations that are part of that.
Mm-hmm.
So we have 2 questions. One of what area of the country do these farms oysters end up being sold to? So where will you find these oysters sold?
That's a great question. So where can you find these oysters? Well, one, wherever you're buying oysters, ask for them. But they can be shipped all over. And so some oyster farmers are selling their oysters to local markets. Others are shipping from here. There might be a lot of people shipping like to Houston, to Nashville. I know, so I grew up in the Detroit area, and I know at least one of these farms is sending oysters to Detroit. So there's the potential that they can go anywhere there's demand.
They're kind of a sort of a luxury product. So these oysters, as I understand it, and this may have changed since the last time I was told these numbers, but these oysters might sell in like an oyster bar in a nice restaurant for say $3 a piece. And so the watermen, the oyster farmers, get more for this product than they do for the wild-caught oysters.
Yeah, so the question is about sort of the market price for these oysters. And so farmed oysters do cost more to produce when you're producing them in this way, even if you're producing them on bottom. So there are some places where people may be getting oysters from a hatchery and putting them on bottom to grow just like a wild reef might. And so that doesn't necessarily involve the same investment. But I mentioned earlier, these oysters are similar in size and fairly similar in shape. And so with farmed oysters, you tend to get a more reliable product. And that's not to say that a wild oyster can't be beautiful and have a nice deep cup, but there's more consistency to the product. And there's also more labor that goes into producing it. And so the price is a little bit higher. And remember, when you're buying it at the oyster bar, the farmer isn't necessarily getting that price when they sell their oyster. But it is more of a higher end product, or a sort of, people refer to it as boutique, which some people love, some people hate that designation.
In addition to pulling the baskets up in order to dry them and address some of the fouling organisms, again, they're other animals and they're just unwanted they're like weeds, they're unwanted in the oyster.
Right. They serve their purpose, but we don't need them in our farm.
Right. But they also sort of move the baskets sort of to prevent the oysters from attaching to each other, and then they sort of break the growing edge, and it makes that deeper cup that you were talking about.
Right. And so depending on the site, in some cases, so with these baskets, they're designed to rock and move with the waves. And so there's some places where farmers, this is enough wave action that it sort of tumbles their oysters and produces these nice cupped oysters. And other sites or other gear, you might have to tumble, and so we can hear the tumbler behind us, or the sorter. And so with that, you can't see it from here, but essentially it's a tube, a long cylinder that they sort their oysters through that has different size openings. And actually, if you want to check the Auburn Shellfish Lab page, there was a video posted on Monday with a tumbler over at Navy Cove. But so it allows them to sort them by size, as well as help doing some of that, the sort of breaking of the edge to produce the shape of oyster that they want.
So when we look at this, how long can these oysters stay out of water? And then we do see that some of these oysters are dead, as you pointed out a minute ago. So how long can they stay out, and then what determines the mortality of them?
So how long can they stay out, and what determines their mortality? There's a lot of factors. So oysters are overall pretty hardy animals. they, in some places, are where they're intertidal, might be exposed for 12 hours, or not, they won't be exposed for the full 12 hours, but maybe 6 hours a day they're exposed to air. And so in some places people might try to dry them for 24 or 48 hours and they'll still survive. But what needs to be thought of is multiple factors. So if it's really hot, then they're not going to last as long out of the water. If there might be disease for oysters, like dermo, which is not something humans can get, but is something that could potentially hurt oysters, they're not going to last as long out of the water. Just like any animal, if they're not healthy, then that could be a stressor. Or if there's a storm event that brings sedimentation, that's another stressor that you have to consider. So there's sort of multiple things to think about when drying. And I will point out, so that just in terms of health reasons, these oysters, for example, as we're sitting here on the deck talking about them, nobody's going to be eating them anytime soon. And so that's important too, is with the regulations, we're not keeping oysters out of the water longer than it is safe.
So when you say safe, you mean safe for human consumption?
Right.
Because inside those oysters, they may have a little bit of bacteria in the water that's in their shell, and if they're out in the sun and they're closed up and they're not open to flow filtering through, then that bacteria may be proliferating in there, and then it may become an unhealthy dose of bacteria for a human. So there's timing involved in when they're raised and how long, and the temperature and the time of year when there's more bacteria in the water naturally, and how long they're out of the water, maybe allowing that bacteria to proliferate, and then how long you allow time between that happening and then the harvest.
Right. So the industry is very regulated to make sure people stay safe, and farmers want to adhere to that, and they know that that is part of their responsibility, as it is for anyone on the supply chain, even as the consumer. And so essentially, especially in hot months, you want to keep oysters cold. And so having them sitting on a sunny deck, or if you're shucking at maybe this weekend for 4th of July, you would want to have them covered, have them on ice, keep them cold to keep them safe. And it's not the bacteria is in the water. It's just the fact that allowing it to heat and incubate over time is what creates the risk.
So we have a comment, interesting program, recently had farmed oysters in Apalachicola, so that kind of answers or helps answer that question. These to me are a much tastier product. Glad my alma mater is part of this agricultural program. War Eagle. That from Cindy. But you had mentioned ask for the oysters. Some of them have names. Like they have trademark names, like the Murder Point oysters, or what are some of the other named oysters from our area, and so people can ask for them?
So some of the other names we have, Murder Points, Point of Pines, there's Isle Dolphins, and so there's a variety, and I'm missing some. Navy Cove, where we were at on Monday. And so essentially, I would suggest anytime you're eating oysters, ask where they came from, whether they're wild or farmed. Sort of figure out their provenance and where they were grown, where they were sourced, where they were harvested.
Kind of like taking an interest in your wine, your wine regions,
exactly,
and soils and profiles. And Dr. Walton did answer the question about how many oyster farms there are in Alabama. He said there are about 22 oyster farms in Alabama now, 8 in Mississippi. So there are 5 in this park right here, but there are multiple parks, and there may be multiple farms within each of those parks.
Right.
And so a last question that we have, we speak to the farmers and the restaurants, how has the situation at hand kind of impacted some of that?
All right, so a question about sort of the current situation for oyster farmers and restaurants. And so with COVID-19, as I think everyone's aware, it has taken a hit on the restaurant industry. And why this becomes problematic, especially for people that produce seafood, is because most Americans consume seafood in restaurants rather than at home. So when people aren't going to restaurants, there's not as much seafood being eaten, not as much being sold. And so there's been a lot of effort to sort of provide, with farmed oysters as an example, ways that you could have them at home and have them shipped to home or pick them up curbside from a wholesaler. And so I encourage people to look at options. And if you have questions, you can send a message to the Shellfish Lab on Facebook. But there are a number of different sources that are out there right now to help connect people with oyster farmers to be able to buy oysters, support this industry in a time when their sales have been dramatically impacted. And it's a great time to learn to shuck.
Yeah, so we have a comment to be sure to visit Oyster South for a list of many southern oyster farms. So there's a website, I guess, for...
Right, so if you go to oystersouth.com, it will have a list of oyster farms that are members all throughout the South. And so now with Texas coming on, sort of Texas all around the Gulf, up through the Carolinas, even to the Chesapeake. And so that's a great source. You can find local farms, restaurants that are part of the Oyster South network.
Good.
All good options.
Good information to have. And was there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
I don't think so. And if anyone has other questions, keep on posting them, and I'll check the Facebook page.
And thanks so much for taking us out here this morning. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We are continuing to bring our Boardwalk talks to you virtually. Our next talk on July 15th, we will be out at the Grand Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve with Dr. Jonathan Pitchford. So hope you all can join us then as well.
All right.